So in this module then, I want to talk about land use and environmental issues involving Alaska Native groups. And I put here a very not controversial topic because of course, when we talk about land use, when we talk about environmental issues and things like pollution and what is wise use of the land and things of this nature, that can often involve complicated feelings, that can often involve charged feelings. These are issues that hit home, I think, especially for us as Alaskans, where, we are outside a lot of the time. A lot of us are relying on these resources, whether the extraction of these resources, the fishing of these resources, whatever the case may be. So these are complicated and charged issues. There are also issues which are sort of near and dear to me in the sense that as a scholar, this is kind of one of my main areas of focus of research and one of the things that I think is most important and valuable to study. So I hope I can kind of do it justice here. Now, I want to tell kind of two stories, a tale of two cities. Well, here it's a tale of two stories about Alaska Native people and resources and environmental issues. And, one of those stories, the first one's going to actually kind of branch in a few different directions, and the other one will mainly focus on the one story. So the first story I'm going to start off with is Pebble Mine, which you may or may not be familiar with. You did a reading about Pebble Mine in a video today, or this week I should say, which was by the United Tribes of Bristol Bay, which is a group of 15 local tribes that are opposed to the mining of to the Pebble Mine. So Pebble Mine is a proposed mine. This has been going on since about 2001. There's a group called the Pebble Limited Partnership, which among other things involves, what is that group called? Northern Dynasty, which is a Canadian company, as well as Anglo American, which is a very, very large mining company. And those two groups, both of which I think are non-Alaska oriented, I know that Northern Dynasty isn't, but who have this Pebble Limited Partnership kind of mining partnership thing going on, have been pushing since 2001 to open up a pit mine in Bristol Bay area. Bristol Bay, underneath a certain part of Bristol Bay, you have I think it's called the West Pebble deposit, and it has billions of dollars potentially of gold. I believe it's copper and molybdenum. So there is significant money to be made from this, which is one of the reasons why this has been pushed for a very long time. Efforts have been going on to try to push for this for, like I said, 2 decades now at this point. At the same time, that mine would occur in close proximity to the Bristol Bay watershed, kind of within the Bristol Bay watershed actually. In the Bristol Bay fishery, these sort of sets of streams and lakes that we call Bristol Bay, that is a major fishery for Alaska and indeed for the US and indeed for the world. It's I think one video was saying it's the largest red salmon run, really, and it produces $1.2 billion every single year. And it produces, in terms of job income for Alaskans, primarily $658 million. And it produces on average about 12,000 jobs a year. So, this is not small potatoes economically speaking. It's not sort of an issue of, the mine, jobs versus environment or something, so much as it is, sort of mining jobs versus fishing jobs, among other things. So there's kind of this tension here where you have groups on both sides, this outside mining company, but then a lot of local people who are really opposed to it. Not all local people, I'm not saying that, but certainly a significant percentage of folks living in the region that are opposed to this, including 15 of the local tribes covering about 80% of the native population for Bristol Bay, who have united as this sort of United Tribes of Bristol Bay group to advocate against the mining since 2013. Actually, the tribal opposition goes back even a few years before that, but 2013 was when UTBB was formed. The opposition here, we'll talk actually a bit more about it next week as well, because we'll be talking about religious and spiritual connections to the watershed. And what we'll see is that even though Yupik, Dena'ina, and other native folks in the area, even though there's been a lot of Yupik, Dena'ina, and Alutiiq, I should say, even though there's been a lot of culture change and religious change, and many folks have converted over, or their ancestors have converted over to Christianity, very often Russian Orthodoxy. Despite this, and in some ways because of this, there's still very strong spiritual connections to the watershed in a sense of how one's supposed to treat the salmon, in a sense of sort of the creator and the spiritual sort of nature of the landscape. And so people have a very spiritual connection there. People also have, as you can see with this number up here, a very practical sort of economic dependence on this watershed. A lot of people are in the fishing industry up there, and a lot of people, even if they're not in the fishing industry, are using it for subsistence fishing. And so you have this tension then between the mining group and what it can sort of offer, and then the opposition to the mine. And again, you have tribes in the area by and large sort of uniting against the mine. And, this is partly because of the perception of, well, and I shouldn't even say perception, this is what the scientific studies have said about what causes would come from the mine. In 2014, after a significant period of time, the Environmental Protection Agency concluded in the environmental impact statement that, because, basically the federal government, given the nature of the land and the type of operation that would be done and the fact that it would affect waters and things of this nature, you would need an environmental impact statement. You would need the federal government to sign off on it. And so they did that environmental impact assessment process, and the EPA concluded, quote, "The mining of the Pebble deposit at any of these sizes, even the smallest, could result in significant and unacceptable adverse effects on ecologically important streams, wetlands, lakes, and ponds, and the fishery areas they support." So EPA basically comes out and saying there's really not a way to mine this well and to not have there be significant effects on the fishery. And so as a result, then we start to see why groups would oppose it, of course. And again, this is a good example of an environmental issue where, environmental issues sometimes get really simplified in the news, right? And it sort of becomes, jobs versus environment. But this is a really good example of where it's sort of jobs versus jobs, right? Where you have a group arguing that it would be bringing revenue and jobs in, but then local folks saying, well, we currently have jobs related to the fishery, and this would really negatively affect it. And now as we think about that story, I want to think of it from the perspective of a concept called environmental justice and another concept called environmental racism. So allow me to explain what I mean by both. Environmental justice is actually I'll tell you the definition, then I'll kind of give you an easier way to understand it with like a metaphor. So the definition of environmental justice, it's a term that we use for those of us who study environmental issues to describe when the environmental harms and benefits of things are evenly distributed across a population, regardless of race, class, or any other kind of background, like religion or gender or something. Basically, this is saying, in any society, particularly an industrial society like our own, a modern industrialized society, there's going to be both harms and benefits of the choices we make to mine, to burn fossil fuels, to choose to log a certain forest, to choose to fish a certain area, whatever. There's going to be impacts. And so environmental justice says, it describes a condition in which the impacts are evenly distributed across the population. In contrast, environmental racism describes when that doesn't happen, when there's disproportionate harms to one race or ethnic group more than another. That doesn't mean necessarily that that's intentional or that it's because anybody is being, quote, a racist, right? It's not like, I don't know if you ever saw the TV show Captain Planet when you were a kid. Maybe that's just me because I grew up in Oregon in the 90s. But in the stupid TV show Captain Planet, there was like these like evil polluting villains that would sort of be laughing about the fact that they were polluting people. Environmental racism does not mean that that's what's happening. It doesn't have to be intentional. It doesn't have to be anybody being sort of an evil person or something. In fact, a lot of times environmental racism happens for some fairly banal reasons, some fairly straightforward reasons. For example, groups that are less well off tend to not have as good of legal representation, so those tend to be the areas that cannot do a lawsuit when a pollution activity is happening near them, unlike wealthier areas. Or they might be a group that needs the jobs worse than a wealthier area, so they're more likely to accept and allow polluting industry into their community. So there's a lot of reasons this can happen, even just there's a dirty factory in the middle of a city, property values go down, so the people that move in are generally people that are of a lower socioeconomic class in the United States. That doesn't always, but sometimes and often correlates with being an ethnic minority, and as a result, then you have an environmental racism situation where the impacts are uneven, right? You're more likely to be having to deal with air pollution or toxic waste pollution or, a dirty, stinky sort of factory next to you if you're from a specific group than another group. Again, it doesn't mean that anybody did that intentionally. It means that that was the effect. you can have that same thing and not have it be actually a race issue. We sometimes call that environmental classism. So think, for example, of like the Appalachian Mountains, where you have groups that are dependent on coal jobs that are, typically these sort of lower socioeconomic class white communities. And that are often dependent on coal mining jobs, but at the same time, the coal mining, if it's done in the way that it's often done with like mountaintop removal, can cause really bad leaching of minerals into the, of like gold and things into the, into the water, cause acidity and things, make the waters really unusable for things like fishing and different things. So that's a good example of it's not necessarily a race issue there so much as it is a class issue, and those things sometimes correlate together. An easier way to sometimes explain this is I like to compare it to a pie, and that's what these two images have. Every society produces a pollution pie, a yucky, stinky pollution pie. That's just, if you still want running lights in your house, and you still want to drive your SUV around like I do, and you still want to have smartphones that have rare earth metals in them, there's going to be a certain amount of pollution. That's the nature of the lifestyles that we have. And so we have this pollution pie, so to speak, and we can reduce that pollution pie over time by getting smarter about how we do things, doing mining in a better way, doing oil in a better way, whatever, having more fuel-efficient cars, whatever the case may be. But generally speaking, you're a modern society, you're going to produce a certain amount of pollution. So you've got a pollution pie. And in an environmentally just society, everybody gets an equal portion of the pie. Joe, John, and Jamie here in this example, they each get a third of the pie. Because there's 3 of them, so they each get an equal portion. By contrast, in an environmental racism situation or an environmental classism situation, you have John getting a huge piece of the pie, and it just so happens, that John is a person of color, or if we were to call it environmental classism, it just so happens that John is the one with the lowest socioeconomic class and income than Joe and Jamie. So it refers again to that idea of disproportionate harm. You're getting a bigger piece of the pollution pie than you really should based on your population. So when we think about Pebble Mine, we need to think of it sort of through an environmental justice perspective. And I would say both thinking of it in terms of potentially environmental racism issues in the sense of a disproportionate impact upon Alaska Native communities who are in that region who are still doing a tremendous amount of subsistence hunting and fishing. And also sort of just more generally an environmental classism issue for sort of local communities, native or otherwise, who are depending on sort of those jobs, but may not have nearly as much power and legal representation in some cases as an outside mining company. That doesn't mean that I'm saying that job or that mine should or shouldn't happen. I am suggesting that there are going to be disproportionate impacts for certain people, and also that those impacts are disproportionate in the sense that it would be local communities primarily that would be having the biggest brunt of the impact, although it would also just more generally affect the fishing industry globally. But sort of local communities that rely on those jobs would be potentially the most affected, whereas, the gold and different minerals would be being exported primarily outside of Alaska. So again, that's not sort of me saying for or against Pebble Mine. I'm just pointing out that from an environmental justice perspective, you sort of have the harms concentrated in one area and then the benefits sort of not concentrated in that same area. So it's sort of potentially an uneven situation, especially if it's not done well, especially if it doesn't lead to comparable employment for locals. Another example would be the Exxon Valdez oil spill. I like to use this one as an example of environmental justice issues and environmental pollution more generally, because I think it's one that, partly because it's been a lot of years at this point, I think it's one that, and it also partly because it was really an industrial accident. It was sort of an industry gone wrong. I think it's a good example to use because it's maybe not as politically charged as some other examples we could use. I think everybody agrees, that this was a tragedy and sad thing that had ever happened. So when the Exxon Valdez oil spill happened, it obviously spilled a bunch of oil into, Prince William Sound area. And as a result, there was a tremendous amount of effect on local fisheries and shellfish, especially, and other animals. Seabirds, like herrings, were also really strongly affected. And these things caused the Chugach Corporation, which is one of our big Alaska Native corporations that's in that area. This caused Chugach Corporation to have to file bankruptcy in 1991 because a lot of their among other things, a lot of their income was coming from the fishery. And so when that collapsed, that caused a huge financial issue for them. They have since recovered, but it's also been 20 years, right? Well, 30 years at this point. Am I the only one that thinks of the 90s as like 20 years ago or maybe even 10 years ago? This comes from me, being a child of the 90s. All right, well, we're going to move now from the politically not very charged, something we all agree was a big problem, to perhaps the much more politically charged issue of climate change. And so let's talk briefly about sort of climate change. And I don't want to get a ton into or debate a ton about sort of the science of climate change. Whatever your thoughts on sort of the root causes of climate change, I can kind of tell you that the mainstream scientific consensus is definitely that it's anthropogenic in nature, that it's being driven in part by fossil fuel and deforestation and different things. But you can choose to not agree with that or have a different perspective on why it's happening. I think the part that we sort of would all agree on is whether or not we agree on the causes is we can agree on sort of the fact that the climate is changing, right? That average temperatures are increasing and that the sea ice is thinning out. And we can see that just based on sort of satellite images over the last 30 years. We've lost about 50% of our typical sea ice in Alaska since 1979. And, our overall average temperature has increased several degrees and is likely to continue to do so for a variety of reasons that I'm not very good at explaining. The Arctic warms a lot faster. In a situation where you're experiencing warming, the Arctic warms a lot faster than other areas. So again, whatever our thoughts on the causes of climate change, the climate is changing, right? And that presents significant issues for Alaska Native people. Not to say only issues, right? One could bring up potential economic opportunities raised by that, such as, whales that are coming further up north and can now be used for whaling in a different way. But probably more so, most of the impacts that are caused by climate change are ones that would be negative or deleterious for Alaska Native communities. As it's put in the Roderick book, as public policymakers increasingly acknowledge Alaska's at ground zero for the effects of climate change, however, few have acknowledged that Alaska's Native people and rural communities are at the center of the ground zero. So let's talk a little bit about what we mean by that. As Roderick points out, sea ice arrives later, recedes earlier, and is thinner than ever recorded in human history. So as long as we've been charting the thing, ice is much, much thinner than it's been in the past. This is a map of, I'm trying to remember, I uploaded this a few days ago, and I should have put a caption with it. I think this is your maximum sea ice extent, so it obviously varies throughout the year, but these are taken during the same time of the year. And as you can see, 84 versus 2016, we've lost a significant portion. And so, and it's not just sea ice. Sea ice is sort of something we use in the Arctic as a way of sort of signaling or sort of showing in a very obvious visual way what's going on, because people sometimes don't, it's not as visual to talk about like permafrost thinning out, or it's not always as visual to talk about like, 2 degrees Fahrenheit increase. So sea ice is a good way of sort of visually showing what's going on. But there's a lot of impacts overall from the generally warming trend that's going on. And so I'm going to talk about a few of these, and some of these are just from one source or another, but the vast majority of them I'm taking it from an EPA study that was done, so US EPA. And they bring up several different things. One of the things they talk about is big time loss of lakes and ponds. So this is showing 1950s to 2000. So, you drive through Alaska, and I don't know about you, but I'm just blown away by how many lakes and ponds we have. It's crazy. And yet at the same time, many of these areas have started to shrink. So this shows areas that shrunk from 180 to 10 acres, from 90 to 4 acres. So, it doesn't take a genius or a fisheries scientist to realize that if a lake was once 180 a pond was once 180 acres, and now it's, 10 acres, it can't support as much wildlife, it can't support as much fish. Same thing with a lake. So that's certainly an impact if you are, like many Alaska Native communities, especially like in Yupik areas, Gwich'in areas, and Yupiaq neighbor areas, but really kind of all over Alaska. If you're in an Alaska Native community that does a lot of fishing, this is obviously a concern. If you're in an Alaska Native community like in Yupiaq communities, which gain a lot of money through allowing oil leases and doing oil leasing and doing service work on oil lines, this kind of perversely, climate change also impacts the oil industry in the sense that you have a shorter window in which you have the ice roads. So you have a shorter window in which it's really easy to transport the ice through trucking. And so you have a shorter window for oil extraction. Permafrost thaws. So as you were probably aware, in the northern parts of Alaska, you got a lot of permafrost that's underneath our communities, underneath our soil, underneath our roads, which is fine when the permafrost stays, well, permanently frost. But with climate change, what we're starting to see and have been seeing for a couple of decades now is a lot of permafrost thawing out during part of the year. So you have basically the soil shrink for part of the year. That's not a good thing. Any of you who are into like structural engineering or something, that's not a good thing for roads or highways, many of which go right over that permafrost. It's not a great thing for airstrips. It's not a good thing for coastal buildings. In fact, this shows 12 different Alaska Native villages that are considering relocating. And as you'll know, most of them are either coastal or on a waterway, and a lot of what they're experiencing is really fast rates of erosion. Sea ice acts as like a buffer for basically the water effects on the land, and so it buffers from erosion. So once you start to lose sea ice, it becomes a lot more likely in areas like Shishmaref, which has been really hard hit, to be losing portions of your soil that your homes are built on, and you literally, have like areas where like buildings are starting to like fall down, like sink, and be a health threat. Same thing if you're on rivers. There's also concerns with that, and so especially if you've got permafrost melting off. So these are big issues, right? We're talking about entire communities that at some point might have to think pretty seriously about whether or not they want to, at the very least, sort of build further inland and potentially relocate the village entirely. You also have, even in the more short term, kind of this issue of, a bunch of roads and different things that need repairs, and whether or not there's any money for that, especially, in a situation like we have where we have a budget shortfall. You have a lot of other issues as well. Ice fishing, which is practiced a lot by Alaska Native groups in northern areas, becomes a lot more hazardous when the sea ice is thinning out, obviously, which might then mean that people obviously don't feel as comfortable doing ice fishing in the winter, and therefore, people are then going to the grocery market more. And that doesn't mean they can't find food, but a lot of times in rural northern Alaska Native communities, that food's going to be real expensive at the grocery store, a lot more expensive than going ice fishing. And, it's not sort of the traditional way. And so that's a cultural effect. You have lichen loss. So lichen, which it looks like a plant, but as you probably are aware, it's more like kind of a combination of a fungus and a plant, a symbiotic thing. It's actually really cool. Caribou eat lichen. Warming causes scrubland to take over lichen land in the tundra, so you get the spread of like scrubby bushes instead of the lichen, kind of crowd out the lichen. So as a result, scientists are predicting that most likely that'll cause less lichen, which will most likely cause less caribou. Which, in addition to the fact that the wolves and the bears aren't going to be terribly pleased about that, neither are Alaska Native communities that are, hunting caribou, as well as anybody else that's hunting caribou in the north. There's, as we've seen over the last several years, certainly down here on the peninsula, hotter temperatures typically mean more likely to have severe wildfires, as we've seen a lot in the States this year, in the lower 48. It also makes the kind of temperature gradient that spruce beetles like, so you get more beetle kill, which is a big issue here in Soldotna. Increased erosion again, and also more diseases. So something that we don't always think a lot about when temperatures are starting to get warmer is that a lot of pathogenics, so for example, like mosquitoes spreading certain kinds of diseases or other organisms spreading certain kinds of diseases, like a warmer temperature gradient. And so as it gets sort of progressively warmer, you sort of have diseases moving north, so to speak, and affecting wildlife and potentially people. So lots of impacts potentially from climate changes, and impacts that affect all of us. Like I said, here in Soldotna, we can take a drive around and see all the beetle kill, and drive through the refuge and see the big burn that they had. On the other hand, it's certainly issues that from an environmental justice perspective perhaps particularly stand to affect Alaska Native communities, partly because groups don't always have the same sort of vulnerability to their environment, and let me explain what I mean by that. I teach for a living, as you've probably gathered since I'm your teacher. So, if there's increased forest fires and it gets harder to fish, I'm not super affected by that. I would be extremely sad, obviously, but it's not going to directly affect my livelihood, nor does it really directly affect my culture, since I don't come from Alaska, and I'm neither indigenous to this land, nor am I like people who's, maybe aren't native to Alaska Native, but have been here for generations or been here this whole life and have this really strong cultural connection to these resources. That's not really where I'm at. So one could say that I'm not as vulnerable to something like a decline in the salmon run or something like a disappearing lake. It'd make me sad as a hiker. Certainly it'd make me sad and concerned as somebody that, wants my fellow Alaskans to have good opportunities, but I'm not, as strictly speaking, vulnerable to that. But for a lot of Alaska Native communities, especially in certain more rural areas, fishing, hunting, and gathering is still a big part of people's food base. Especially as you move up north, you're talking about people that live in icy, remote, rural places where it's hard to, rebuild a road. It's hard to get cheap food at the grocery store. So those folks are sort of particularly vulnerable. So for me, as somebody that's done a lot of environmental justice work and some kind of consulting in that area and stuff, I would argue that Alaska Native communities present kind of an environmental justice problem here, a problem in the sense that they're particularly vulnerable, as are a lot of rural Alaskans, not just folks from Native Alaska tradition. But I would add that with Native Alaskan communities, they tend to be in some of the most remote areas. They tend to have some of the highest percentage of folks that are doing hunting and fishing. And they also, for some of these communities, still have this very active sort of spiritual relationship with these animals and with these lands. So there's a lot of kind of vulnerability and environmental justice concerns there, that there's a disproportionate impact from things like climate change or an offshore oil spill or something like that. By the way, I hope you enjoyed the reading by Marino and Schweitzer, talking about climate change without talking about climate change. I thought it was funny. They talked about the fact that sort of when you spoke to local people, specifically local Inupiaq people, when they were doing their interviews, if they would bring up global climate change, people would kind of, yeah, sure, of course, and, kind of give a brief explanation, and that brief explanation would sort of match what other, anybody else across the country would probably say about climate change at this point, because most of us have learned about it at one point or another. But usually sometimes with kind of the caveat of, I really shouldn't be talking about this, that's kind of an interesting, as these two anthropologists bring up, it's kind of this interesting cultural thing going on there where people aren't supposed to, in Inupiaq society, traditionally aren't supposed to sort of overgeneralize in general. That's considered to be a childish behavior, and especially not to sort of speak about nature presumptively, because nature is sentient, right? So you're not supposed to sort of assume what nature's going to be up to. So people would talk about climate change, although they'd be kind of iffy on it. But if you didn't say climate change and instead just sort of asked folks like, hey, what's been changing? What have you noticed about your environment? Folks would bring up all sorts of things. So the example they share in the reading is, there's this lake that used to be really big and now it's like dried up. It's tiny. And interestingly, there was a different explanation than, CO2 emissions or something. The explanation was that because an artifact had been messed with and brought home, that had sort of offended things spiritually and caused this loss of this lake. But the point I'm trying to get at there is you don't have to sort of use the climate change way of talking about climate change to acknowledge that there have been changes and that those changes affect Alaska Native communities.